Rachel was near about the prettiest girl in all of Goldsboro, and she was one of the sweetest people you ever want to meet. All the boys were just crazy about her. Even the countryside boys came in to meet and spend time with Rachel. The girls in town, however, they wanted Rachel to settle down so that they could have a chance to go to the dances with some of her beaux. But Rachel, she was picky. He's too small. He's too big. He's too sweet. He's too mean. It went on and on and on, until the day George Dean came home from university and caught Rachel's eye. From that moment on, she was smitten. Well, you can imagine how tickled she was when George came waltzing up her stairs and asked her to go strolling down the lane with him. Well, that was it. Rachel ditched all her other beaux and only had eyes for George Dean. They were inseparable. They went to dances together. They went to parties together. And it didn't take very long for George to get down on that bended knee and ask Rachel for her hand in marriage. Well, you know Rachel said yes immediately. And she and her mama set about planning all kinds of things. What to buy for the house, what to buy for the wedding. Planning, chitter, chitter, chitter. Well, George, he didn't have any interest in any of those things. All that frippery, he'd leave that for the women folk. So he decided he would spend his time at the local pool hall with his friends. And it was at the pool hall that he met Helena. Helena was the saucy daughter of the pool hall owner. She had an air about her that George had never seen before. She was beautiful. She was exotic. She was exciting. She was a bad girl. And George was in love. He started spending more and more time at the pool hall and less time with Rachel. Now Rachel, she was no dummy. She noticed that his attentions were elsewhere. She started asking questions. Well, Rachel's friend Anna was more than happy to relate the story to her about Helena and George at the pool hall. Well, Rachel, she went berserk. She stomped her feet and she wagged her finger at George and she said, "George, you are my boy. You are going to spend time with me and nobody else." Well, that didn't sit too well with George. He decided that he would toe the line and he would spend the rest of his time before the wedding with Rachel. Well, the day of the wedding dawned bright and beautiful. All the bridesmaids and Rachel and her mama, they were all in the dressing room, all chitter-chattering and excited and pretty, waiting for the wedding to get started. And in the vestibule, all the groomsmen waited, and the best man waited, and the preacher waited. But there was no George Dean. Where was George? The time for the wedding came and went, and George was nowhere to be found. What had happened to him? Had he had an accident? Was he ill? Was something wrong? They started running all over town trying to find him. But George's little brother, he had an inclination. So he went down to the pool hall and started asking questions there. Sure enough, he found out that an hour before the wedding, George and Helena had taken off with bags in hand. Well, that was not how it was supposed to go. And with dread, Rachel's mama had to go back in and tell Rachel the sad news. She opened the door and she saw her beautiful daughter practically glowing in her beautiful white dress with the long train and the pretty veil with all the pink trim. And with a heavy heart, she told Rachel what had happened. Rachel went white, and she stomped her feet, and she yelled, "No! This can't be true! George is my boy! He is no one but mine!" And she stomped her foot, and when she did, she froze and became stiff as a board and fell like a 2x4 to the floor. She was dead in an instant from a heart attack. And right then and there, Rachel's wedding became Rachel's wake. Well, a few days later, they buried beautiful Rachel, still in her glowing white gown with the long train and the beautiful veil with the pink trim, under the oak tree in the church cemetery. Right as all the black-clad mourners were exiting the church, a very happy couple, George and Helena, pulled back into town, unaware of what had happened during their absence. They had spent a glorious weekend on the Outer Banks, celebrating their honeymoon. Well, when George's dad got one look at George, and Helena's dad got one look at George, the two of them pounced on him and started swinging fists every which way. It took the preacher to pull the two men off of George. George's family spit at his feet, and Helena's family swore her off right then and there. They didn't have any choice but to hightail it out of town, which is what they did. Well, as most scandals go, the flames begin to cool. People move on and forget about things, and life has a way of moving on. Everybody forgot about George and Helena until 1 year to the day of Rachel's wedding. George's dad dies dead on a doornail right in the middle of the street of a heart attack. Well, you can imagine that rekindled all the flames and all the gossip surrounding the story. All the townspeople knew that this was going to be something else, because George's daddy was going to be buried just a few feet down from where Rachel had been buried a few days earlier, or a year earlier. Everybody came to George's dad's funeral to see if George and Helena would have the decency to come and pay their respects. But George knew that that was not a good idea, and he was smarter than they were. He rented a small motel room on the outside of town, and he waited until dark to come and pay his respects to his father. As he kneeled down at the feet of his dad's grave, he unburdened himself of all the woes he had experienced in the past year. His wife Helena had left him for another man. He had lost his job and couldn't get hired anywhere in the nearby vicinity. He was at his wits' end, and he was on his last dime. And as he felt himself unburdened and all of that sadness come out of his eyes, he heard to his right the sweetest sound. He heard someone call, "Georgie! George!" And he was so excited, and he was filled with hope. He just knew it was his mama come down to tell him she had forgiven him and all was better. Or maybe it was Helena, and she had come back to him, and she had forgiven him, and all was better. But when he looked to where he heard the voice, the sweet "Georgie," he saw this thing rise up from the ground, this long, white, tattered, rotted gown, and this face of fire, and eyes like a cat in headlights, with this tattered veil, little tiny, now gray strands hanging around its face, and it grew to the height of the oak tree. George covered his mouth to keep the bile and the fear that was welling up inside of him, to keep it from coming out. And at the same time, he raised out his right hand as if he was going to ward off this thing. But the creature reached out and grabbed his hand, as in some grotesque, macabre handshake. When it touched his skin, he felt instant white hot, and he felt the bones in his hand just crushing under its strength. He pulled with all his might to get away from this thing, but he could not release its grasp. It pulled him, it pushed him, it willed him up off of the ground and drug him towards the steps of the church. "No!" he screamed. "No!" he screamed as it pulled harder and harder on his arm. Eventually, he made it to the steps of the church. Up one step, up a second step, and finally on the top step of the church, he pulled with every ounce of energy he had, and he heard a sickening pop. But he was free. He fell down those stairs, and he ran pell-mell as fast as he could back out to the trail that led back to his motel. He took a second to look behind him, and he heard the awful, awful clatter of this voice that said, "George Dean, you're mine." It took every ounce of energy he had to make it back to the motel. He begged the manager to call for the doc to come and help him. He crashed across his bed, and he laid motionless. He looked down at where his hand used to be, and there was nothing there but a withered, shrunken stump, like a log in a fire. He felt the burning sensation rise up his arm and into his shoulder, across into his chest. He felt as if something were standing on his chest. He could not breathe. The doctor finally came in after what seemed like an eternity. He walked over to George. He took one look at him, and he shook his head. He used his fingers to close George's eyes, and George was surrounded in darkness. The doctor knew he was dead. There was nothing else he could do. As he turned to walk out of the room, he started to leave, and then something called him back, and he said to the lifeless, still air in the hotel room, "He's all yours, Rachel. He's all yours."